Thank you for joining me today. I am joined by Paul Deitch Cummings, who is a finance guy. And for anybody who knows me, I am not a finance guy. Um, Paul has had an interesting journey that we're going to talk about that makes him an unconventional finance guy. Although, for those watching and who need a finance guy, he is legit a finance guy. He's got some pretty heavy connections. He's got some amazing core values. And Paul, I'll give you some time here if you wouldn't mind just telling everybody. We know who you are now, but tell us, what do you do?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I guess I've had so many titles and things over my career, expert, guru, professional, but really for me, I consider myself a financial strategist, and it's really about creating strategies to help people build wealth and pass it down to their families instead of giving it away to the government and financial institutions like so many people do. Because, as you know, John, there's a lack of financial education in this country, and it's a major pain point that I've gotten to experience personally, and I've gotten to help pretty much everyone from all walks of life, industry levels, income levels, ethnic backgrounds. So the way that I like to say it now is it's really been my life. My ultimate goal is to help as many people as possible achieve financial freedom and live life on their terms.
Okay, so you've said something there that is important to me. Help other people, and it's one of my core values. Um, I believe in, it's a cliche quote, but I believe in it
Yeah.
that um, I will reach my goal by helping other people reach theirs. For me personally, obviously, it's in the leadership, coaching, and mentoring world. Um, I love what you say about generational wealth, and I think that a lot of people think that's beyond their reach. I think that because somebody makes 30, 40, $50,000 a year, 60,000, whatever, they think, oh, generational wealth is not something I can build.
Yeah.
And I know you are proving that wrong. You are proving that it doesn't matter whether you make $1 million or you make $10,000. What matters is you got to live the right way, making the right decisions. So, how did you land in this, Paul?
Yeah, that's a loaded question, John. So I grew up pretty unconventionally. I was born and raised in Hawaii. I grew up with my grandparents. My mom is actually probably one of the worst people that I know when it comes to money, and my dad was a drug addict. So there really was no correlation to what I do and who I am if you looked at the family or my parents and ultimately grandparents, because I grew up in such a different generation. Since I was 10 years old, I pretty much had my life planned out that I was going to be a neurosurgeon. And, I started going to college when I was 16. And then obviously a year later, from our first conversation, was really the kind of the turning point in my life. Both my grandparents passed away, my dad passed away, and my mom became medically disabled. And why I say it was a major turning point for me is because I was 17 years old and I didn't know how to take care of myself, yet alone how I was going to support my mom and my sister. And I wasn't taught anything about finance. It was actually, I would go as far to say as it was considered a taboo topic in my house. Anytime the conversation would shift about money, it was like nobody would say anything. And even throughout conversations with like family members or even in school, it was just something that you didn't talk about. And the reason why it became so impactful is Hawaii. A lot of people see Hawaii as like a dream location where it's somewhere that they want to go. Yet it's probably one of, if not the most expensive places to live. So you really do have to be financially savvy in order to make it there. And for me, the way that I kind of found my way into finance, if you will, is I supported my family financially when I was 17. I'm just going to put the transparency out there. Like, I didn't know what I was doing probably up until the past like 3 or 4 years, really. And I spent a lot of that time just really kind of not unlearning, but evolving all these ideas and things that I was kind of programmed to believe when I was younger. And what was fascinating is that because I grew up with my grandparents, the phrase that I always heard throughout my entire basically childhood was if you work hard, you'll be successful. And the way that I got to financial stability wouldn't be realistic for a lot of people because I wasn't 18 years old. So legally I couldn't qualify for a lot of jobs that I was, I guess, technically qualified for based off of like my intelligence and skill set. But for me, it was a legal thing. So I basically just had to work multiple jobs. And I remember at one point I worked 20-hour days for 2 years straight. And I remember just thinking what my grandpa told me, if you work hard, you'll be successful. And I remember just laughing because it's like, man, I'm like killing myself, but I'm barely getting by. So the the more that I hear these stories from people about, man, I'm just like killing myself, like I'm barely getting by. I really understand because I was there. I know how it feels to work a lot. And then what I realized from that is that you hear from a lot of people saying that there's a massive money gap between the people at the very top and the people at the very bottom. And I didn't really think that was the case because I mean I was making money just by like working a lot. If you work enough hours, you'll make money. But the amount of money that I made was irrelevant because I didn't really know what I was doing with it. And that's when I kind of realized it was more of a knowledge gap per se than a money gap. So to kind of just go into I've been in finance for the past 7 years, and I've won a lot of accolades. I've been a master debt eliminator. I've had an article that was featured in a global business, finance, and news magazines like Bloomberg, Yahoo Finance, a lot of these big outlets. And what was so interesting for me was it all started in the banking world. And I've always been a firm believer that in order for you to teach or talk about something, you have to do it for yourself. So the way when I first started in the banking world, I had no desire for this to be my career. The way that I saw it actually was kind of like a two birds with one stone thing. Because I wanted to be a neurosurgeon, I knew that a major pain point that a lot of doctors and surgeons had is that you made all this money, but they didn't know like how to manage it and what to do with it. So I would see a lot of people who, you're making like, I don't know, 6, 7 figures a year, but like you're basically living paycheck to paycheck or even probably over your means because, there's so much money coming in, but you're not keeping track of what's going out. And that was something for me that was really intriguing, not only because I wasn't taught anything, but here I would have to support my family for the rest of my life. So working, I knew that I needed a job to support my family, and that's kind of how it started. And then throughout probably the first year in my banking career, for me, it was really just about educating. I learned a lot from watching what thousands of people a week were doing. So that was like probably the greatest accelerator was I got to see a lot of the strategies that other people were doing. And ultimately, I got to see how that didn't work. And I know we'll talk about that later, but the first year for me was really just about learning, figuring out what to do for myself. Just because when I'm talking about I had no financial education, I mean like the only two things that I really knew how to do were I knew how to read prices at a grocery store or at a store, and I knew how to spend less money than I had. I didn't know anything about how to balance a checkbook. I didn't know about all the different accounts. I didn't have credit. So like I really started, I guess you would say, from the bottom. And it after that first year, and I started doing a lot of things for myself. I was I would see people, and the unique thing about my career in banking was while my title was probably like, I started off as a teller, I really played like so many sub roles that you don't get credit for. Like I was a therapist, psychologist, like all these things, because people are basically telling you kind of all of their problems. And I've always been a analytical problem solver person, so I would kind of just plug what I was learning and a lot of these actual real life situations. And I, over the past 3 years, it was how I became a master debt eliminator. Won a ton of accolades. When I left the banking world, I was probably like right under a manager. I didn't want the role because it was. We'll probably get into that later. I had a hard time with leadership and all those type of things just because my perception at the time was different than what it is now. And I'll tell you what was the fascinating thing for me is that over my banking career, I got to help everyone. It's interesting when I hear a lot of people talk about finance, and when I came on LinkedIn, you have this huge consensus where people would tell you like, oh, you have to niche down. There's riches and niches. And what I would always tell people is I don't want to be rich, I want to be wealthy. And for me, it was always different because I actually had the experience, not only from actually doing it, but because of the way that I grew up, it was so diverse, meaning like I grew up with my grandparents, so that was like the older generation. My mom was a lot older when she had me, so that was like the generation before. A lot of my friends' parents were younger than my mom, so that was the next generation. And then obviously I had, myself. So I really got to see life from many different perspectives and like the generation gaps. And over my finance career, I got to kind of see a lot of the pain points that everybody was experiencing. And the whole underlying problem, or I would say opportunity that so many people miss, is that when it comes to finance and money, we all want the same things. It's just that it looks different for everyone else. And that was really a big part of my finance career, was helping people get financial clarity, right? What does that look like to you? And I would say the hardest part for a lot of people was the mindset part, because I don't believe that financial literacy is a problem in this country because of the resources, that we have access to. The problem is that where people are financially programmed to do things that aren't in their best interest. And we all don't know what we don't know. And what I found from a lot of these conversations is that you had people who were teaching people things that weren't necessarily the truth, but it was the truth that they accepted. And this is a huge problem that I would go as far to say is even something that I deal with today, because the one of the greatest secrets that I've learned about life from my experience is that everything is relative. What means nothing to you can mean the world to somebody else. You can achieve someone's life dream in a day, and you really aren't going to be able to understand people unless you walk every step in their shoes. And finance became kind of a similar thing. And over the past year and a half, when I stepped into becoming an entrepreneur, it was something that I even had to look at for myself. Like, the people that you're following, why are you going to follow somebody who isn't either where you want to be or hasn't done what you're already trying to do? And this was a huge thing that I would find when I would meet with clients. Like, they would they were listening to people who weren't aligned with what they wanted to do. It was just that this whole term of like expert, and this is why I don't really subscribe to any of the titles, is that it's all subjective. And finance, more than anything, is a subject that I find that a lot of people really don't know anything about. So in the beginning, when I told you like I didn't really know anything, right? Like I was like at the very bottom. And what happens is when we tend to not know anything on a subject, anybody who knows a little bit of something, is always going to be positioned as the expert. And that's a huge problem. My finance career has been so different because I've always had to come in and play a fixer, if you will. I was always the person that would have to come in to clean up a lot of the messes. And one of the things that was a massive differentiator for me has been empathy. In an industry where people treat clients like another number, for me, I really learned to treat them like people. And what I found was that when I would go into a lot of these meetings and people were upset because I I was never one to focus on telling people things. I would try to teach. And I'm sure as you know, John, from being a mentor, like sometimes teaching is like painful because you gotta get in the ring and you gotta be willing to take the punches, especially when you're trying to teach people something and they'll be like, oh well, why wasn't I taught this? Or it's like, why didn't the previous person teach me that? There's a lot of hostility there. And I really had to understand that for them, they just sometimes they didn't know kind of how else to react when you're like blowing their mind with this information. And what's interesting is the every time like I go out in public or I go to the airport or whatever, people will always ask me like what I do, and the question that I always get asked is like, "Oh, what's like your finance advice, or what can you tell me?" And I always tell them, it's such a loaded question because not only do I believe that it's unprofessional and unethical to give any type of advice without context, it's it's tough because I can't tell you what you want, and in my entire career, I would say that's been the number one challenge is that people lack financial clarity. If I ask somebody like, what do you want your ideal life to look like? What does that look like to you? I always get blanks on that question, whether it's like visually or financially, because so many people, with the way that the world shifted, I'm finding it that people are having a harder time looking to the future when they're just having such a hard time getting through the present.
Yeah. Well, you're not wrong. And here's what I'll tell you, Paul, is that um, I don't know anything about finances, so I never get asked those questions. The only financial question I ever get asked is usually from somebody on the street. Hey, do you got a couple dollars? Um,
Yeah,
and I don't carry cash at all ever. So I always ask, well, do you take American Express or Visa? Um, but I get the same thing as a leadership coach and a mentor. Even in my logistics life, when people find out what I do, you get peppered with all kinds of questions. And you're
yeah,
right. You're spot on. Now, first, I will say if you're watching this and you're that person that asks those questions, please don't ever stop because I love talking about what I do. Obviously, Paul loves talking about what he does, and we will get into some other layers of this as we move along. Paul has some pretty impressive mentors, and we're going to talk about that. But it does happen, Paul. And a lot of times it doesn't happen directly, but it still happens where someone will say, they'll be telling me a story about a frustration, and I'm a problem solver. So, and this just happened to me yesterday. Someone called me to tell me about a frustration that they're having with someone else. And at one point, I had to stop them and say, hey, quick question. Are you calling to complain or are you calling to vent? Because there's two different outcomes. Said, if you're calling to vent, I will do my best to just hear you. And and that's it. I'll just try to hear you. But if you're calling to complain, I have to do something about that. I have to drive some change there. And
yeah,
so, I don't think it's, I think, a lot of this potentially could play into some levels. I don't want to go as far as to say the imposter syndrome, but it plays into some levels of a person's inability to have faith in their own decision making. And so they hear what you do. And let's face it, Paul, not many people say they want to get wealthy. A lot of people just want to get rich quick. And
yeah.
there's two different paths in life, and here's what I've seen. I've never once in my life seen anybody follow one of those get rich quick schemes and get rich or wealthy, except for the guy who produced the commercial, the guy who wrote the email, the guy who got you to click on it, because that's how they're getting rich. They're getting rich quick because you've agreed to give them 199 a month or whatever it is. So yeah, I'm with you on that. Every situation is situation specific, and it's hard to walk up to somebody and say, "Oh, you're a finance guy. Tell me what your advice is on blah blah blah," because
Yeah.
let's just be specific. So if I were to walk up to you and say, "Hey, Paul, tell me your advice on company XYZ and their stock price," that is also a hard question to answer because number one, you've got to have a vested interest in that company to have an opinion on what their stock price is. Number
Yeah.
two, you have to have some idea of what the goal is to know or to even really form an opinion. If you're and I'll go a little bit deeper in this. For me, I'm a collector, so I don't go out and buy shares of a company with the intent that I'm going to flip them. One
Yeah.
time I did that, and I'll tell that story. But um, so what I do is I collect cool companies. I collect shares of companies that I think are neat, and I also only do it in uh, increments of two because I have two daughters, and at some point they're going to split whatever it is I collect. Um, but the one time I did go out, buy a stock and flip it, it was the Berkshire stock. And I worked for a Berkshire company, and the stock split off and it became affordable. So I went out and I bought some of it. And over the course of a period of time, it went back up. And I was like, hmm, they're never going to pay dividends on this. The only thing it gets
Yeah.
me is access to the show, which I work for that company. So I'm always working that weekend anyway. So I'm
Yeah.
like, the heck with it. So I sold the stock and I remodeled the bathroom.
Yeah, that's an interesting story, and it's interesting when you touch on the stock market, right? Because one of the fascinating things that I found in my experience, and I just want to preface my comments, like I would say that I didn't really get to where I'm currently at until probably the past, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, and my life changed when I got out of the banking world. And the reason why I say that is you a lot of times, like, and I see this throughout on social media, a lot of people are just regurgitating a lot of the same information, that's been passed down like year after year. You hear all these financial literacy experts that'll tell you like, oh, you open a Roth IRA, you do this, do that. And when I know John mentioned earlier, like when I started training with elite mentors in business and finance over the past year, 2 years, the fascinating thing that I learned is that the true experts and like people who really know what they're doing, they don't do the same things that everybody else is doing. A lot of the things, the advice and perspectives and paradigm shifts that I was given are completely opposite to a lot of these things that you see a lot of the everyday people doing. And what I'll say on the stock market is the past 2 or 3 years have been some of the most volatile in the past 20, in terms of people losing a lot of wealth and all these type of things. And the question that I'll always ask people is how are you going to build something that you consider generational wealth in a vehicle where everything can be lost overnight? And the part that's so fascinating for me is I hear a lot of financial people refer to Warren Buffett as kind of the world's greatest investor. And what a lot of people don't understand about Warren Buffett is, so one, the number one rule of money is to not lose money, and rule number two is, follow rule number one.
Right.
And yeah, he talks, and if you looked at what he didn't dabble in the stock market like how a lot of people are doing. He actually bought companies. So that's a huge difference, right? Where when you own majority of a company, it's a little different if they go down a little, whereas like you're a small little stockholder and then you're losing a lot of money there. And that's what one of my mentors told me. He said, the biggest mistake that financial professionals make is they talk to people about things they either don't know about or they have no control over. And over the past 2 or 3 years, cryptocurrency was a hot trend in the finance world. Financial services is such a very interesting term now. I mean, I've seen so many different things that are looped into that one category. I had to really look into it because you have like cryptocurrency, credit repair. I mean, just so many different variables of finance. But it was interesting because over 80% of people who became millionaires in cryptocurrency lost everything, right? And it it goes to show that what people really need is stability. And one of the greatest lessons that I've learned from my experience is that it's not about the asset as much as it is the reliability of the income. Because I know a ton of people who have real estate that is not cash flowing, so they're not making any money from it. I know a lot of people who have a lot of money in like IRAs and 401ks and all these things, but one, most people don't even know that uh, for the 401k is a tax code. It's not actually an asset. So once you put your money there, you have to actually put it into assets. So that's a huge thing there. But there's so many videos that you can refer to. And one of the biggest things that I've done that's kind of disrupted a lot of things in the finance space is really educating people on what a lot of these strategies were intended for and how the reason why so many people are experiencing financial hardship is because the world's changing. And a lot of these strategies, that people have been using for the past century are becoming obsolete because those strategies have evolved over time.
Mhm.
And yeah.
Yeah, valid point. So, you have an interesting mentor. Are you ready to talk about that, or do you have any other things you want to cover before we dive into that?
No, we can get into it.
So, go ahead and give us an introduction to your mentor.
Oh man, I got a lot of mentors, but I think the big one that you want to know about is I joined the mentorship group last year called 10X, which is primarily with Grant Cardone, who's a real estate mogul. And yeah, it was an absolute transformational experience for me. And I don't necessarily look at it from a financial perspective. For me, when I did it, it was more of a acceleration to entrepreneurship because I was a first generation entrepreneur. So I didn't know anything about like marketing and all these different things. And the entrepreneur world is so different than the employee world. I remember being when I was in the banking world, I was reflecting about this, is that it was so easy. Like you saw thousands of people a day, you got to pull up their information. And for me, I really just got to do research. While I'm having a conversation with them, I'm looking at their accounts, seeing like, hey, what can I do to help save them money or whatever. And when I went on my own, I realized how uncomfortable it was because now you have to go out and actually talk to people. And it was a huge evolution because we were just coming off of COVID, where a lot of things switched remote. And when I was in Hawaii, it was it was really different because it changed the whole perspective. Over half of our small businesses went out of business during COVID. And when I took time away from the banking world in, I want to say August of 2020, and I spent probably about a year working for a government contractor, and that was actually what inspired me to get back into finance. Was I was working on an unemployment project, and I got to see people who, when I was in the banking world, we had this saying of like save your money for a rainy day. And everybody was like, oh, that rainy day is never going to come. And for many people, COVID was that rainy day. And it was a huge perspective shift for me because over the year that I was working for this government contractor, I talked to probably like thousands of people a week. and they were either in one of two situations. There really was no middle. It was like they needed money desperately because they were about to be evicted, homeless, or whatever, or they were like barely getting by because they had a savings. And then it was like that was their backup plan. So to give context, that was really the experience that kind of made me realize that finance was my purpose. And the biggest thing that I learned from training with Grant Cardone is that this whole idea of 10x was really transformational for me. I know when I first started, a lot of people thought it was like all about money, 10 times the amount of money you make. But it was really about a personal, just overall transformation. It was about 10xing every area of your life, health, fitness, your spiritual, recreational, whatever it was, like all these different pillars of life. And I learned so much from him. And it's it's interesting because I know you want this to be about finance, but one of the reasons why Grant Cardone has really come to the forefront is with his real estate company, Cardone Capital. He's giving everyday people access to, Class A assets that are primarily made for a lot of these like trillion-dollar massive companies that like the everyday person couldn't have access to. And I was really just inspired because for me, I'm the type of person that anybody that I get mentored by, I want to have like some type of relation. And that's why I think for me, all the mentors that I've had have had these incredible stories like I did, of overcoming impossible situations. And I know we'll talk about that earlier or later. But yeah, that's really what it was about was training with elite people, learning like how they think, but what was really more transformational than anything was just seeing how he lived their life. I mean, I've gotten to talk to Grant Cardone multiple times, and he's a down to earth person. He's just honest and I guess like you would say brash. He's the big like you. I'm
Yeah,
sure if
he
you're
yells a
watching
lot.
this video, yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah,
that works for him, and it's a brand that he's been
yeah,
able to
yeah,
harness, and he does it well. So let me just be very honest. I didn't want this to be about finance. I wanted this to be about you, because
yeah,
when people talk to you, and I know, your thing is, I believe. Please correct me if I say this wrong. Impossible equals I'm possible. I believe that's your thing, right?
hmm
Yeah.
yeah.
So
My live show.
yeah, this is what I want people to see, because I get contacted almost every day by finance guys, and I tell them the same thing I said to you. Appreciate you reaching out. Here is the link to my calendar. Let me know if you want to talk. And of course, they all want to talk. So when I get them on, I say, hey, appreciate your efforts. I'm not your ideal guy, um, but let's do a Zoom talk. Let's put it up on the YouTube channel. Let's tell people who you are.
Yeah,
And I know I told you this, Paul, but you are the first person out of dozens to say, sure, let's do it. And here's what I appreciate about that is, um, we all know there's regulations and there's things that you can't talk about. And quite frankly, those are boring things that nobody wants to hear about anyway. So let's
yeah,
not talk about them. And so what people do want to know is, so you're looking as people are looking at you, Paul. I know you've gotten this before, but you look like you're 12 and you're giving massively wise financial and life advice to people. And
hmm
I think the neat thing about you is you're an unconventional finance guy because you do look like you're 12. People are going to listen because they're like, oh, look at this cute little kid who wants to talk numbers. But then you actually tell them things that make sense, and you tell them real stories. I feel like I'm Grant Cardone. You got me all worked up. I'm yelling at you. Um, you know, you tell them the real stories about your struggle.
yeah,
And for those who have ever been to Hawaii, they'll know what you're talking about because you have extreme class issues there. You've got
hmm
the very wealthy that live there, and of course you don't see them because they're up on a mountaintop somewhere and they've bought an entire part of the
yeah,
island. And then you've got the people who actually work on the island. And my wife and I, we rented a car with the kids and we just went driving. and we went exploring. We hit
Yeah.
two of the different islands while we were there. We hit that's not important, but yeah, we actually hit one of the islands that you grew up on. And so I saw what you're talking about, where there's such an extreme gap between the
Yeah.
the real backbone of Hawaii and then the people who just go there because it's a luxury vacation place or a luxury
Yeah.
place to live. So, I think that's the story that people gravitate to because there are so many people struggling just to get by today. And
Yeah.
I read some stats about the people that are paycheck to paycheck, and some people that are less than paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes you stand out is that you're a kid who can tell that story. You can
Yeah.
tell specific examples of what it's like to have no money and have massive amounts of responsibility to go to the point where so you joined 10x, and I'm gonna try to be a good comedian and bring that back around. Um,
Yeah.
and that's where I think there's a lot of people out there that are going to say, yeah, what does that really mean? Because is it like when you join all these other groups that are sponsored by these mega stars, mega rich people, mega stars, you pay to become a part of their club, and then you get to watch them on video as you're sitting in the auditorium, and maybe they'll walk on stage and they'll wave at you and whatever, sign some autographs later. But what is it really like when you join this club? Do you actually get one-on-one time with Grant and his team to say, okay, help me be better. Help me achieve the success I want to achieve. Here's my goals. How do I get there?
Yeah. So to answer that question, I'm trying to think, probably like a handful of times in the year that I was in the mentorship program, I got to ask him questions. I got to see him at events and things like that. And what was really fascinating to me about this whole idea of 10x, because there were a lot of people who, I don't like this word, but I know like it's something that you've talked about. Like, I don't like the word like imposter syndrome just because it sounds like negative, and it's like, in my experience, a lot of times when people tell me that they have imposter syndrome, a lot of times it's warranted. If you're trying to teach something that you haven't done before, like, it's kind of, how are you going to do that? And what I thought was so interesting about it was it really created a community of like-minded people. And that was so important for me because I was the outlier, in my family. And I just remember when I left Hawaii, a lot of people were kind of just curious. They were just like, I don't understand like why, because if you looked at where I was when I left, there really kind of was no reason for me to leave by the average everyday person's standards. I was making enough money where I could support my family, do whatever I wanted to do, uh, taking care of, I did that for 8 years until I left last year in March, taking care of my mom, which is a goal, for every child. I've helped probably like over 1,000 people in my career, like really transform their financial life. And I was slowly dying on the inside. Like, I just knew that I was capable of so much more than I was achieving. And that's where, chasing your potential instead of accepting your reality came out. And the thing that I had to learn, and what 10X really did, was it really shattered a lot of the limits that I had on myself. Because when I read the book, the 10X Rule, and it was a great book. I highly recommend for everybody to read it. It really gives you a different perspective of money and finance and just like thinking bigger. But what it really showed me was I was playing too small, and I think for a lot of people, if you're watching this video, you can probably relate to that of having dreams when you were younger, and over the course of time, whether it was kids, getting married, unfortunate circumstances, life tends to like beat you down, like as you get older, per se, for a lot of people. And what was really interesting for me is that I've been the youngest person in probably 95% of professional rooms that I've been in. I'm in a lot of high level, not only net worth, but just powerful communities. And I'm one of the probably one of the only people in my 20s. I don't know of anybody, who else who's in their 20s, but I'm sure like around the world there's somebody, there's always someone you don't know about. And what was interesting for me is that that was the first time where I think a lot of people never saw me as like this 20 plus year old, because my life's been accelerated by decades and decades and decades because of all the adversity and experiences that I've had to overcome. And it's really taught me that adversity is like the greatest gift. And I'm a big believer that your story will become someone else's survival guide. And that was 10x, if I'm being honest, was really the catalyst for completely changing my life. It was the reason why I left Hawaii to come to Florida and train with elite mentors. And every single time the world's told me no in my life, I've always told myself yes. And that's really what the program did for me. Was it's given me access to some of the most incredible people that most people don't get to meet in their lifetime. It was funny
Mhm.
when a lot of my friends and kind of old coworkers and customers, as they were watching my journey unfold over the past year and a half, and they got to see all the people that I got to meet, the events, and all these things that I got to go to, they were really inspired because that was something that they never thought was possible, not only for themselves, but just being from Hawaii, like people don't strive there to do like massive things like I'm doing to change the world. It's very family based. Like you kind of keep up with the trend or the generation. Like if your parents did this, you tend to follow suit. There's a lot of like business succession, like all these type of things. And why a lot of people have really resonated with my story is that I've always been an outlier, and it it's just been like I say it all the time, but I've taken the road less traveled my entire life, and it truly has made all the difference for me.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's neat, and I appreciate you sharing what the 10x mentorship program looks like. I think that there's folks out there who are curious about it, and I think this is a great format to just kind of really say, yeah, it's real, and yes, if you're serious about it, you can do it. So, I know one of the things I kind of gave you a hard time about last time was your journey from Hawaii to Florida. I thought, that's the
Why?
most, yeah, that's the craziest thing ever. But I know, now obviously I know the story, but I think
Yeah,
that's a really difficult decision for someone to make. And the way you explained it to me is it wasn't difficult at all. You knew what you needed to do, and you did it.
yeah,
Can you walk us through the journey that you took there when you said, okay, I got to go to Florida?
yeah. So it really all started with my aunt, who's my favorite person in the world. And it's funny when you look at all the things that I'm doing, and if you know who she was, it it doesn't correlate because my aunt doesn't care about like money whatsoever. And but the reason why this was so important was I really got to learn over the past 3 to 4 years that home isn't necessarily about a location as much as it is about people. And I knew that when I was going on this journey, I wanted to have as much like support as I could because I know that I would need it. It's tough being an entrepreneur. A lot of people that are close to you are sometimes like your biggest critics because people get so caught up in the statistics, right? Like I don't even know what it is, but it's like over 50% of like businesses like fail in the first like year, or like it probably higher honestly. But and there's anytime you do something like that, there's a lot of negativity. And my aunt's always been the person that rooted for me. It was So that was kind of in a nutshell what that was. But what also really helped me, I think, is when I say that I've been an outlier my entire life, just to give people a kind of context, like Hawaii is a very, I'm trying to think of the word. I don't want to say like racist, but like it's very like ethnic. dominant. Like there's certain races that they treat very differently. And I've identifying as an American there, if you don't know the history, Hawaii was illegally taken over by the US, is something that I got a lot of flack for. And what the reason why I always identified myself as an American is because when I did research into the old, like you'd learn about Hawaiian history and all these things, it was very much a class system where your life was dictated based off of like the family that you were born in and all these type of things. And the thing that I love so much about the United States, and we've all seen like the incredible stories of triumph. If you weren't in a position like that, because a lot of these people, like if your family defined what your life would look like, you wouldn't see some of the most successful people in the world because I mean, there's just no way. But that's the beautiful thing about life is that, and being an American allows you to do whatever you want to do as long as you're willing to work for it, and you put the time in. And it's funny because ever since I've been training with all these elite mentors, there's always one person in the room that asks the question, like, what's the secret? Like, and they all say, like, the secret is to, like, do the work, like, my mentor has a
Exactly.
saying, my mentor has a saying, like, everything works when you work. And,
Yeah, that
um,
so many people get lost in like, oh, I want that
yeah,
easy button. Yeah, that easy button is called sweat equity.
yeah, for sure. And that's really what it was for me. I knew from the time that I was little that I just didn't belong there because I felt very differently about a lot of the conversations and things that people were talking about in school. I never really identified with, and I guess that was kind of the short reason for me. I was never like a lot of people in Hawaii where they never leave the island. Like I always knew that I wanted to leave, and it it just so happened that I had the time. And when I look back to, because the only reason why I didn't leave to go to college was because my grandpa was dying. So I stayed at home to like help my mom take care of him and things like that. So it was kind of something that I always wanted to do. And when I saw that 10X was based in Florida and a lot of the events were here, and uh, yeah, that's pretty much what happened.
Okay. So, Paul, you're licensed to do business in what states?
So for me, currently it's Hawaii and Florida, just like the two places that I was in physically. And the goal for me, eventually it's to be in all 50 states, but basically what happened was I was very fortunate to meet a mentor who's within the top 1/10 of 1% of financial professionals in the world. And when we were kind of having conversations about like, because he was kind of mentoring me at the time, he was like, well, you could invest money to get licensed in all these states, or um, you could just do it where it's something that we do together, right? Because he's licensed and I get to
Mhm.
learn. And the reason why that model ended up just sticking was when we would meet with people, he has so many powerful connections as well. It would almost be kind of like a double benefit to them because not only would they get to learn from like both of us and our stories and our connections, but he would literally like put them in touch with people who would elevate their business. So that was kind of just a huge thing for me, was really just focusing on impact. And if it meant that I
Mhm.
had to take the back seat, uh, I was okay with that. It's for me, it was really about putting my impact over my ego and having to be like the person who's the star player. I'm just really grateful to serve.
Okay. So, Paul, how do people track you down if they want to work with you?
Yeah, so I would say the biggest way for people to get in touch with me is definitely on LinkedIn. It's been my favorite social media platform, and I I pretty much I'm on like Facebook and Instagram and all these things, but I don't really use it besides like keeping in touch with family or like personal friends or whatever. It LinkedIn's definitely the best for business, and on it, it has like my website and all these type of things that people can get in touch.
Okay, well, that works. So if you're looking to get a hold of Paul and you live in Hawaii or Florida and you want to do business with him, in the comments section of this video, you'll find the link to his LinkedIn page. And of course, the majority of people who are watching my videos have found them on LinkedIn. So I will share Paul's information there as well. And if you're looking for a finance guy who understands what you're going through, then you found him. Here he is. So I want to thank everybody for watching. If you're still watching this, we're grateful. Please hit subscribe and hit the notifications tab. That way, when the video does go live, you'll get it pushed directly to your phone. Paul, any parting words for anybody watching?
Yeah, I just want to say that for everyone here, when I was younger, I used to believe that financial professionals, advisors, like any type of like specialist in finance was only for wealthy people. And that was the message that was kind of passed down when I was in the banking world. I got asked this question the other day, and I want to share it here of is financial freedom like possible? Is it a reality? It is absolutely a reality for every single person. I can show you many different people that I've helped that come from pretty much every single situation that you can mirror. And the biggest challenge that I found is just making that effort. So I welcome anybody, if you want to have a conversation, feel free to reach out to me. Happy to just share some information with you. Maybe you probably have somebody or you think that you have things put in place. And the reason I'll share with you the most important piece of financial advice that I was ever given. And that's the best time to get something is when you don't need it, because when you do, it's usually too late. And the reason why that is everybody thinks that they have their financial situation taken care of until a tragedy happens in life that shows you that
Hmm.
you didn't. That was my story.
Yep.
Um, with my grandparents. When my grandparents passed away, there was no like money, plan put in place. And if I didn't do what I did, like my family would probably be homeless. So I just want to share that with everybody here. Don't be more afraid of being nothing than being something. Have that conversation and it could just change your life.
That's awesome, Paul, and I think that's right. And I do hope. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get your Calendly link, and I'm going to put in the comments of this as well. In the event that someone did stumble upon this, not from LinkedIn, and doesn't have a LinkedIn account, because I think that you have some real value to add, and I'd hate for somebody to miss out just because they can't track you down.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for your time, John. It's been an incredible conversation, and I'm so grateful that our paths crossed on LinkedIn.
Same here, Paul. Thank you so much, and again, I appreciate everybody who's watching.